Welcome to this explainer for HIS 240, History of Kentucky. I am so incredibly pumped to guide you through this today. We're going to break down exactly how to absolutely conquer the evidence and analysis assignment for this survey class, using chapters 1 and 2 as our master guide. Let's just dive right into this because honestly, understanding how to find and leverage historical evidence, it's the absolute bedrock of thinking like a true historian. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll be mapping your module journey, decoding the evidence and analysis assignment, examining the historical question, looking at arguing yes for an empty wilderness, arguing no for a native homeland, and finally closing it out with the reflection step. All right, Section 1, Mapping Your Module Journey and Understanding the 6-Step Process. Let's start by zooming out a bit to see where this specific assignment actually fits within your overall workflow. Because, understanding the big picture is totally crucial for your success in this course. Every single module in the survey class follows this exact super logical 6-step progression. You're basically moving from an initial unresearched guess all the way to a fully supported historical conclusion. You get the overview, you take a swing at the question, you read for context, check your knowledge, dig into the evidence, and then you reflect. The module overview explicitly lays out this journey, and I love this because it brilliantly illustrates the scientific method of history. You first answer a question based strictly on your current knowledge, and hey, there is zero penalty for being wrong there. Then you acquire context by reading the chapters. And finally, you revisit that exact same question, but this time you're armed with primary and secondary evidence. Moving right along to Section 2, Decoding Evidence and Analysis, which is the absolute core of your grade. Now let's zoom in on the real meat and potatoes of this module, the evidence and analysis assignment. This is your time to shine and prove you can think like a historian. This bad boy is worth 35 points, making it the most heavily weighted component of the entire module. So precision here is key. This isn't just about sharing an opinion, right? It's about actually proving a claim, which is exactly why we're going to look very closely at the grading rubric. To secure those 35 points, every single one of the 3 pieces of evidence you submit must strictly contain these 4 elements, no exceptions. You need 3 to 5 sentences summarizing your evidence. You need another 3 to 5 sentences explaining what that evidence actually shows. Then a highly crucial 3 to 5 sentences connecting that evidence directly back to the main prompt. And finally, the easiest point to get, but also the easiest to forget, you absolutely must provide the specific textbook page number for your citation. As the assignment sheet spells out, your evidence has to be highly specific, written in complete sentences, and this is incredibly important, guys, paraphrased in your own words. It literally cannot just be copied and pasted straight from the book. Oh, and using AI, that will result in an automatic 0. You really have to demonstrate your own critical thinking here. All right, Section 3, the historical question examined, formulating a claim. So what exactly are we trying to prove with all this carefully formatted evidence in Module 1? Let's take a look at the actual puzzle we're trying to solve. This is our core historical question for chapters 1 and 2. Was Kentucky an empty wilderness before European settlement? Now remember, in history, there's rarely a strictly right or wrong answer. There are only well-supported claims and poorly supported claims. Whether you decide to argue yes or argue no, your grade comes entirely from how objectively and critically you analyze the textbook sources to back up your claim. You can absolutely answer yes or no and get full credit, provided your evidence aligns perfectly with your argument. Which brings us to Section 4, Arguing Yes, Empty Wilderness, and Finding That Evidence in the Text. Let's look at how to build a really robust yes argument, utilizing that 4-part rubric structure we just broke down. If you want to argue that it was an empty wilderness, you need to find the specific historical context that made early Europeans believe this was true. We actually find a fantastic foundation for a yes argument in Chapter 1. The text points out that when explorers wandered into Kentucky in the mid-18th century, they found abandoned settlements. To them, these empty camps visually confirm the myth of the dark and bloody ground, basically viewing it as a vast, unclaimed hunting territory just waiting to be settled. So the real trick is how you format this for the assignment. Here is exactly how you would do it to get full credit. For your summary, you'd write 3 to 5 sentences explaining that British traders like John Finley found abandoned native camps like Escapagithki in 1752. For your explanation, you detail that native peoples, like the Shawnees, hadn't vanished, but had actually consolidated populations closer to the Ohio River centuries earlier due to climate shifts like the Little Ice Age. Then, for your connection, you'd explain that because settlers physically encounter these empty seasonal hunting camps, they interpreted the entire region as an empty wilderness, effectively answering yes to the prompt from their specific historical perspective. And lastly, boom, you drop in your page number. Now, let's flip the script and see how this builds into Chapter 2, which highlights a massive historical flaw in that perspective. Frederick Jackson Turner's famous 19th century frontier thesis pushed this idea of free land, dividing savagery and civilization. But the text directly, and I mean directly, contrasts this European idea of an empty wilderness with the harsh reality of Native American sovereignty and settler colonialism. So that leads us to Section 5. Arguing no that it was a native homeland using counter-evidence from the text. Let's see how we might construct a really strong no argument. How do we prove, using the text, that the land was actually highly populated, culturally complex, and fiercely defended? Well, Chapter 1 provides some incredible counter-evidence. The text explicitly pushes back against the empty wilderness myth, stating that for groups like the Mississippians and Fort Ancients, this was not just a hunting ground at all, it was a homeland. The visual evidence here is just super striking. A quick look at this map of Mississippian and Fort Ancient sites from the text visually proves that this territory was heavily utilized. We're talking extensive agricultural networks, massive ritual sites, and distinct neighborhoods that existed long before Daniel Boone or any Europeans ever crested the Appalachian Mountains. So to model our 4-part rubric for a no answer, let's turn to Chapter 2. Your summary would outline how Native groups viewed Kentucky as their sovereign homeland. Your explanation would detail how, in October 1774, Shawnee Chief Hokaliskua led hundreds of warriors against Virginia colonists at the Battle of Point Pleasant during Lord Dunmore's War. Then, your connection would clearly state that this highly organized military defense absolutely proves Kentucky was not empty. It was a populated, sovereign region fiercely protected against settler colonialism. And then once again, you cite your page number. All right, we made it to Section 6, the final reflection step, closing the loop. Once you've gathered your 3 distinct pieces of evidence and finalized your 3 paragraphs of analysis using that 4-part structure we hammered home, you move to the 6th and final step of the module. The reflection assignment asks you to look back at the entire process of historical inquiry you just went through. And listen, this isn't just busy work, it is metacognition. It's actively making you think about how you learn and process information. For this final step, you just need to write 200 to 250 words answering these specific prompts. You'll evaluate your own learning process, identify what difficulties you faced in scanning the textbook for specific claims, and point out which piece of evidence ultimately swayed your opinion one way or the other. You also get to put on your historian hat and ask what other questions remain unanswered. As you prep to write your reflection and wrap up this first module, I really want you to consider this final thought. Did the evidence you found challenge what you thought you knew? Because history is almost never as simple as an empty wilderness just waiting to be discovered. It's messy, it's complex, it is deeply human. So how will realizing that change the way you read history moving forward? Good luck with your evidence and analysis assignment, guys, and have a blast diving into the totally fascinating history of Kentucky.